So Paul, welcome to Cambridge.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have you here as our Humanitas visiting professor in sustainability studies. I wondered if you could just start by telling us a little bit more about what it is that you do and what interests you in this field, this broad field of sustainability studies.
Sure. So my focus is on trying to make environmental programs work, to improve environmental conditions without breaking the bank. And I originally was an ecologist, but I moved into economics because I began to see that if changing environmental conditions was essentially about changing human behavior. And if I wanted to change human behavior, I needed to study in the behavioral sciences. And since that time, I've tried to bring together fields from economics, sociology, neuroscience, psychology to try to understand human behavior better, to understand how do we change human behavior, and then work with natural and physical scientists who are looking at how when humans change their behavior, how that affects the environment. So I fundamentally focus on trying to understand human behavior, and because human behavior is complicated, I focus a lot on trying to develop evidence about what works and under what conditions, because it's really hard just to sit in a chair and say, oh, if we do this kind of program, it's going to change the environment in this way. I really think just like in medicine, you're never sure if a drug or a treatment's going to work. You need evidence before you're willing to scale it up. I approach the environmental programs the same way.
So let's step back. I mean, what got you into thinking about the environment and sustainability in the first place? What's the journey? How did you end up here?
That's a good question. I originally wanted to be an animal behaviorist. I didn't have much of an interest in conservation per se. I had some experience watching nocturnal possums in Australia, and I learned two things. One, the rainforest is being cut down, and if you cared about these species, you needed to worry about what humans were doing to change the planet. And two, that these animals were god-awful boring. I didn't want to be an animal behaviorist. So I moved on to ecology, bigger systems, and I was working in Africa, in Madagascar, on a chance encounter in 1990 with an economist from the United States, who we had lunch together, and he told me, he said, if you really care about the environment, you shouldn't be studying ecology, you should be studying humans, because it's all about human behavior. And at the time I was skeptical, but I ended up moving to a graduate school in economics and realizing that economics didn't have all the answers, but an emphasis on behavior was a big part of the solution. And so continued working on that until I was working on incentives, basically paying people to change their behavior, trying to give them concrete incentives to change their behavior in ways that would benefit us all. And a colleague of mine, Subrenda Patnaik from Duke, once asked, well, how do you know these incentives work? And I said, what do you mean, how do I know they work? You pay somebody to do something, they do it, it's not an issue. And he said, well, think about it a little bit more elaborately. Think about all the different ways that humans might respond to incentives. And once I started working that out, I realized that there's a whole variety of possible outcomes, from no effect to actually a perverse effect, where by paying people to change their behavior, we made the environment even worse. And that put me on the path toward really focusing on evidence, that all these great ideas we had for the environment really were not great ideas to be applied, but great hypotheses to be tested. And that we really need to take a much more careful look at the things we're promoting and make sure they work before we scale them up across the globe.
So while you're here with us, those are, I guess, the two main issues that you'd want us to think about, that really we need to understand environmental problems as fundamentally human problems, and also that we need to really understand what works and what evidence we have. So just tell us very briefly what your two lectures are going to be about.
So tonight I'm going to be focusing on the behavioral aspect and really emphasize two things. One is that behavior is much more complicated than we typically assume when we design our environmental programs. We have often very simplistic assumptions about how humans behave that all the behavioral scientists tells us are wrong. And when you start looking at more elaborate models of human behavior, you realize it's almost impossible to predict the human responses to most of the environmental programs that we design, and therefore evidence is really needed. And I'm going to talk through a lot of different insights that the behavioral sciences have brought to help us think about how we might design programs better. That small changes in the decision environment can often lead to big changes in human behavior if you anticipate how humans are going to respond. And then tomorrow I'm going to be focusing more on the evidence side. One of the most popular programs or interventions out there to save ecosystems is protected areas, national parks, reserves. And there's often, again, this idea that, well, they must be working. We've decided that this area is protected, it's inviolate, nobody can go in there, only tourists can go in there. But the impacts that those protected areas have on ecosystems and on the humans that live around them are very uncertain and ambiguous. And we don't know a lot. I'm going to talk about what we do know and what are the big questions that we need to answer if we're going to have a better chance of conserving ecosystems and species.
Great, and just thinking about those big questions, I mean, 21st century environments are threatened in all sorts of ways. Where do you see the big challenges, both intellectually and in terms of sort of practical policy?
Well, and intellectually, I think there's two things that the conservation science, environmental science, needs to focus on. The first one is having a much bigger culture of experimentation on the policy side. As scientists, we're great at about experimenting with a new way of managing tree species or affecting populations of animals. But then when it comes to how are we going to save those trees or how are we going to save those animals, we don't think about experimenting anymore. We just say, oh, I've got an idea, let's go do it. And we need to take that same careful scientific approach that we take to looking at ecological questions, chemical questions, atmospheric questions, hydrological questions, and apply that approach to thinking about policy and program questions. So that's one frontier, is trying to inculcate that experimental approach and thinking about designing programs with the intent of developing evidence. And the other one is this hope and aspiration that the environmental movement has been trying for decades is doing interdisciplinary work. Mm-hmm. That these questions that we're trying to deal with, these problems we're dealing with are multifaceted. There's no one discipline that can contribute. We need to have people more focused on thinking about how do these programs affect human behavior, how does human behavior affect the environment, and how does that change in the environment, therefore affect humans again. And that's not going to happen with each group working in its own silo. And so one of the big frontiers for me is figuring out how do you create incentives for those different groups, those different scientists and approaches to work together on common problems.
I mean, your own personal journey has been very much about moving between disciplines and finding that interdisciplinary position for yourself. What is your thinking about that in terms of the future? I mean, what kinds of structures do you think would facilitate that?
Well, I've been very lucky to have been in institutions where you get professional credit for that kind of work. But interdisciplinary work is tough. It's slow because you're trying to communicate across disciplines and you've got multiple people working on it. It's difficult for everybody to find a professional reward that's going to satisfy both their bosses back home. And it's also difficult. You want to talk to a particular audience, like you might talk to geographers, but the zoologist wants to talk to zoologists. So how do you think about what audiences you're going to present your research to? Those are big deals. And then you've got the practitioners who want to move at a much different pace. Mm-hmm. And I've been blessed to work with practitioners who are willing to work with scholars at their pace and look at bending their questions to what the scholar's interested in, and work with scholarly institutions that value an economist publishing in mainstream biological journals.
Right. I mean, we're embarking upon this grand experiment here in this David Attenborough building. What suggestions do you have for us as we go forward?
Yeah, I'm floored by the opportunity that you all have to have everybody in this one building in one location. I think that's a huge first step of having people in the same building. We're bumping into colleagues from completely different disciplines. You're seeing seminars from completely different perspectives. You've got your graduate students who are often at the best position now to talk outside their discipline. They don't have the same professional pressures on them, and they have more of a youthful desire to stretch their wings. And it's a great first step. And I think the next step is to really think about, well, now that we've got everybody together, how are we going to create the incentives to have people actually working together on common problems, that they all feel like they're getting professional rewards and solving the environmental problems that they all hope to solve together.
Paul, thank you very much for that, and we look forward to your lectures this week, and thank you for spending some time with us.
Appreciate it. It's fabulous.
Thank you.